What are the best birds to use in each round? How should your strategy shift from round to round? This Wingspan Next Level Strategy Guide will teach you how to build infrastructure in round 1, how to synergize your cards in round 2, how to exploit your opponents in round 3, and when to shift to the endgame blitz. This is Flash with Legendary Tactics. This video for intermediate or advanced level wingspanners will give you specific goals in each round, higher level overarching goals, and it will offer up the best birds for each round of the game. If you love Wingspan, please consider subscribing so we can continue to feature this kind of content. Let's begin with round 1. This round is all about mapping out your path to victory, setting up your infrastructure, and focusing your approach. It's bound to feel a little bit sluggish if you don't pre-plan 2 or 3 turns ahead. Your first move is to look at all of the end of round goals. Some bonuses overlap. Pay close attention to what birds are being offered. Then, kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Sorry, I couldn't help myself. For example, check out how I use the mountain bluebird here to meet 3 bonus objectives. Now that is efficiency. I often sacrifice the first end of round goal in order to win the next 3 because the first one isn't worth as much. Another great way to hit multiple objectives is with the star nests. They can become the platform or the sticks, the ground or the eggs, the cavity or the tree, or the bowl, which incidentally looks like a bowl. If you're not distracted trying to fulfill all those end of round goals each turn, you can really focus on maximizing how you use each turn to amplify your endgame explosion. It's important in round 1 to get 2 birds activated right away. This means that your initial choice of cards and resources is really critical. If you can lay 2 birds without ever activating a habitat, then you're like a track star who explodes out of the gates right at the gunshot while your opponents are getting increasingly agitated by their inefficiency. This game is very much about compounding investments. While it's wise to get at least 1 bird in each habitat, it's also key to focus on developing 2 primary habitats and still reaping the benefits of the habitat that you're not developing by having off-row birds. For example, having a raven that produces food when activated in the grassland gets you both eggs and food. So let's talk about the top 4 birds in round 1. If you can get any birds that give you 2 for 1s, such as the ravens who trade 1 egg for 2 food, that's extremely powerful. If you can grab raven gull combos or the raven goose combo early, you'll also be in great shape. You can't ignore the yellow grassland habitat in this game because it's so critical for the late game. So bearing all this in mind, it can also accelerate your engine to lay some lower cost birds first. So my 4 early picks are: number 1, the best bird is the killdeer. This guy lets you ignore the wetland habitat. It discards 1 egg to draw 2 cards. It only takes a worm or a wheat to play, so by far, this is my favorite. Next, I love the Chihuahuan raven. I mean, most of the ravens are fairly overpowered, but this one in particular, if you have this guy, it means you can mostly ignore the forest habitat. Don't worry, the extra cost you pay up front will pay dividends back later. My third choice for top birds in round 1 is the Franklin's gull. The gull is flexible, he's reasonably cheap, and he lets you ignore the wetland. It also features the wild nest star, which means you can use it to fulfill multiple end of round goals. Finally, my 4th choice is the bronzed cowbird. This guy replicates eggs when opponents lay them, which happens almost every turn, especially in 4-player games. Let's move on to round 2. In round 2, I would encourage you to begin building synergies and thinking not of just 1 single bird, but of multiple birds together. This is much easier said than done. We know the ravens are amazing if you get them down early. So now try pairing that up with, say, the northern mockingjay, who lets you activate the raven power twice. You can then use eggs from the raven to cash in on loads of food. This, of course, leads to getting high-scoring birds down with the higher food costs associated there. You should also try to sequence your birds well. For example, the first bird gains a wheat, such as the acorn woodpecker, and then the second bird can use that wheat to tuck 2 cards from the deck, one such as the black-bellied whistling duck. I also like stacking some powers, like having multiple birds in a row that tuck a card from your hand, then draw cards back. The engine feeds itself in both of these scenarios. Pay attention to cards that read when activated versus cards that read when played. There's a big difference here. When activated cards are much better to lay in the early game, so you get as many activations as possible. When played cards are often better when you've got your infrastructure laid. For example, if you put the ash-throated flycatcher down, it will lay eggs on all of your cavity nests. And late game, you'll have way more birds in play to capitalize on this. So let's get to talking about what the top 3 birds are in round 2. I think here it's important to chain birds together. One of my favorites is the grassland synergy domination. So you get your raven, who gets food, trigger that first. Then the Canada goose converts that grain into 2 victory points by tucking. Then you can use a repeater bird, like the gray catbird, to repeat the card tucking and use the second raven resource. In addition to the eggs you gain, you also score 4 VPs every time you activate this sequence. It's so good. I would also say in round 2, the common raven is still a great bird. It's not too late to get this one down and still get some food and benefit from that production, especially if you have that bird in an off row. My third choice in round 2 is the chimney swift or the barracks wren. They can migrate between habitats and maximize your output as well as hitting end of round goals in multiple rounds. So this means that you're always one step further along in each habitat for the rest of the game. And if you have 2 of these, that's incredibly powerful because you can chain those together and they can both move from one habitat to the next. It's time to move to round 3. Well, it's super tempting to taunt your opponents every time they activate a power that gives you a benefit, especially with the digital version of the game, where sometimes you don't see the other person's hand too clearly or what they're up to. Many Wingspan players aren't good enough at multitasking to really notice all the moving parts of the game. So there are 2 lessons to be learned here. Number 1, don't get tunnel vision and ignore what the others are doing and how they're benefiting from you. And number 2, if you see an opponent stacking up on a power, such as egg laying, find a way to benefit from that. There's all kinds of birds in this game that counter every other bird in the game. Round 3 is a good time to play the when activated birds, such as the bobolink, who lays 1 egg on each of your ground nests, and those look like eggs. By now you've developed a good number of birds in your tableau. You'll also still benefit from these instant powers, so try for powers that feed your immediate needs so that you aren't wasting turns clicking for food or eggs. So let's turn our attention to what the top birds are in round 3. I'll go with my top 3 here. So these I think are transitional birds. You're probably not going to be scoring a lot of 1 or 0 point birds because it's getting a little bit late in the day for that strategy. These birds may balance points with abilities. This is also a good round to look at whether or not you should focus on fulfilling your personal bonus objective. Don't forget about that in your hand. The best birds in this round will depend heavily on what you've established in previous rounds, so it's hard for me to pick your best top 3. However, there are some birds that I think are standouts here. I would suggest that you continue to focusing on developing 2 habitats here, one of which being the grassland, so you can lay eggs with a passion never before observed in nature. So the first bird I'm going to recommend is Bell's Vireo. It's a nicely balanced card. It only costs 2 worms to play. It gives you the choice of 2 bonus cards. And why I think this is important now is that you now know what direction your board has taken and the direction of your opponent's boards. And you can capitalize on that knowledge to leverage your endgame score and choose the card that's going to benefit you the most there. It can be worth 4 points to get Bell's Vireo down, plus whatever you can get from that extra bonus card, and it can also be played in 2 different habitats. Take a look at what your opponent's engine is doing, and choose cards that benefit from their play. Often this will be a pink ability card. Though it seems a little late for a pink card, there are uses for it other than to siphon passive points from your opponents. If they're playing the egg laying approach, choose a Barrow's Goldeneye, so you get an egg in a cavity nest every time they play it. My third choice for round 3. Basically, since players will be often shifting to an egg laying strategy in the 4th round, you should consider getting something like the brown-headed cowbird or the cuckoo here so that you can leech from their engine. The cuckoo is also worth 4 victory points, so that's a good intermediate and in-between card. We're on to round 4 now. Wow, it's really starting to heat up in the game. There are not many turns left. This round is all about surging in victory points. It comes down to pure math. You've got to math out every turn and make sure that you maximize your points. All the other 3 rounds were about setting up to maximize this endgame explosion here. You're not going to be playing low point value birds because it's way too late to capitalize on their abilities. Spamming eggs is the default endgame. The grasslands are critical in almost every engine in this game. However, if you have another engine that can outperform your egg lane, such as a card or resource tucking strategy, then you'll probably want to go with that. So there's lots of great birds in round 4. In this round, you're really going to want to be laying down the high point value birds, or playing a bird that lets you immediately play another bird so you can double up. Ideally, these high scoring birds will also align with an end of round goal or with your personal objective. Remember that laying a bird requires eggs, which subtracts victory points. So keep a net gain in mind when you're deciding if spamming eggs or playing a bird is more valuable to you. Often the game can come down to a single point that determines the winner. Top 3 birds in round 4. I'm not naming any that give even the slightest benefit to your opponents because that makes absolutely no sense in the late game, especially when it's hard to know if that one wheat you give your opponent allows them to score a 9-point bird. So the first bird that I'm going to recommend is the blue-winged warbler. It only requires 2 worms, and it gives you 8 victory points in either the forest or the grassland. So it's both flexible, cheap, and it has a high point value. Number 2, the American woodcock is worth 9 points. It can populate 2 different habitats, which is great. That's the forest and the grassland. So pretty solid bird there, no special powers, but you're just after the 9 points. My third choice is the trumpeter swan. It's also worth 9 points. It uses 2 grain and 1 wild food, so there's a little bit of flexibility there. But it can only go in the wetland, which usually for me, it's not heavily populated at that stage anyways. So that is the habitat that I tend to lean away from. So it's often cheap to lay one down there. So to summarize, how you play this game changes from round to round, and it evolves based on number 1, what your opponents are doing. Number 2, what cards you're offered. Number 3, what the end of round bonuses are. And number 4, what your personal objective or objectives are. The birds I've suggested have some really great innate abilities and benefits, but they won't necessarily work in every single game, and you may not have the luxury of using them if they're never proffered to you. So my last piece of advice for intermediate and advanced players is that you stay flexible and work with what you've got. Don't try to force a strategy that's not realistically achievable and that isn't being presented to you there. The beauty of this game comes in its variability. If you haven't had a chance to watch my first strategy guide on the game, it offers a different set of ideas for newer players. I'll link to it above. And if you found value in this video, please join the Legendary Tactics Habitat by subscribing, and peck that like button there if you'd like to see more videos like this. We appreciate your time.